The SNP is inflicting terrible cruelty on Scottish Primary 1 pupils. How do I know this? I've listened to the reports of parents and teachers. They're talking about extreme signs of distress, shaking, crying. Pupils upset and worried. The process is unnecessary and cruel. The biggest teaching union, the EIS, says it's soul-destroying. A Glasgow teacher said it's awful to look at the faces of anxious wee people who are wondering why this stress has been imposed on them. Another said we're robbing this generation of their childhood. What could it be that's so harsh on these Primary 1 kids? Has caning been reintroduced? Are they being humiliated with the dunce's hat? Are they being locked up in stocks? Viewer discretion is advised at this point. Those of a delicate disposition might consider stopping watching if you don't want to hear of the details of this cruelty. What are they doing to these kids? They're making them do little online tests to sit at a computer for 30 minutes answering questions. Now, the way this process works is, first of all, the kid sits down at the computer and they have a practice run at it, and they can redo that practice as often as they like, then get help from their teacher, so they can keep doing it till they've got the idea of the system, of how to use the mouse things to answer the questions, and they have headphones on, and the test talks to them and explains to them what to do next. And then when they do the real test, it'll ask a few questions, then if they've got those right, it will go on to some slightly more difficult questions. If they haven't got them right, it will just stay at the same sort of level, so no one's sitting there getting lots of questions that they can't do. I'm now going to show you a couple of the practice questions. Obviously, this is not suitable for children to watch, but look at this. Frightening stuff, eh? So why have we got this hysteria making these tests sound like child abuse? Well, there's several factors. Partly it's politically motivated. The opposition parties sniff an opportunity to get at the SNP, and that's what they're trying to do. Maybe some of the teachers have got the same sort of agenda as well. A lot of the teachers and the politicians, they've got just an anti-objective testing philosophy. They've got a progressive view of education to also be about vague skills and values rather than knowledge and techniques. They want to be able to say everyone's doing really well, whereas objective tests start interfering with that message. Maybe some teachers are afraid of comparisons with other schools in other areas. Maybe there's some aspects of the test that are not brilliantly designed, but that's not really the heart of the issue here. Another major factor, particularly from the teachers, is Shinarification. Now, Shinari are the well-being indicators of the government's GERFEC, Getting It Right for Every Child programme. They're a huge thing in schools. You'll see posters of them all over the place. Wherever there's a gap on a notice board between the human rights and the LGBT posters, you'll find one about Shinari. Pupils need to be kept safe, healthy, active, nurtured, achieving, responsible, respected, and included. Now, that's all very well, but such an overemphasis on it leads to the view that children are delicate flowers ready to wilt under the slightest discomfort. Well-being ends up being interpreted as something close to keeping them happy. And if they're not happy, it's bad education, it's cruel, it's harming them. Now, this sort of testophobia is not just in primary schools. Look at this. This is from an independent secondary school in Glasgow. At exam time, they're so worried about the children's stress that they got woolly alpacas to come in for the kids to give them a cuddle. Okay, one teacher said about these primary 1 tests, the stress of making children answer a question that they can't understand is unnecessary and cruel. That's just bonkers, isn't it? A teacher saying that asking a question that someone can't do is unnecessary and cruel. No, that's a normal part of education. That's how you find out what people can do and can't do. That's what tests always involve. Another said the tests completely contradict efforts to promote good mental health. Again, it's just crazy. You're going to damage people's mental health by giving them a 30-minute test that might have a couple of questions in that they can't get the answer right to. Okay, kids need looking after. They've got emotional needs, but they need challenging as well. They need character building. The current trend, though, is turning schools into therapy centres, cosy comfort zones. Character building, that just doesn't come into it. Look at this. This is the new uniform at St Shinari's primary school. Well, I should say, actually, that's the indoor uniform. When they're allowed out, when it's not too hot, too cold, too wet, too icy, too sunny, or too windy, this is their outdoor uniform. Listening to teachers talking like that, how are they going to be able to cope with a tough little tearaway who needs bringing into line? Are they really going to be capable of putting their foot down and imposing discipline where necessary with that mindset? This sort of soppy, indulgent educational style where every conversation is going to be conducted like a person-centred counsellor, is that really going to draw men into teaching? I don't think so. So the opposition political parties are all jumping on board. It really is party politicking at its worst. The Conservatives say they support national testing, and yet because they see the SNP on the back foot, Ruth Davidson's now calling for these to be scrapped. Liz Smith's talking about the right of parents to withdraw their kids from them. The Greens are talking about the anxiety caused for teachers. Oh, come on, it's pathetic. Right, the Lib Dems are leading the histrionics. They're saying that it's an insult to teachers. Now, talking about something being an insult, I've got no sympathy for the SNP because they use this tactic left, right and centre, this sort of grievance mongering. And it's not about improving education, it's about getting teachers' votes. So what is this insult that's been aimed at teachers by the SNP? It's the claim that these tests don't actually take up that much time. Does that sound like an insult to you? Of course it isn't. Sometimes you just have to despair at the level of political debate in Scotland. They say that teachers don't learn anything from the tests. Well, in one sense they know the kids pretty well already, but it enables their performance to be compared across schools. They can assess how successful strategies are in one area compared to another. It eliminates the problem where you might have a pupil in one school being regarded as above average. If that same pupil was in a school down the road, maybe they'd be regarded as below average. But if you have these national tests, they'd be able to have a proper objective picture. Now, I don't know about you, but you might have seen reports from primary schools, and generally they're pretty bland. They don't tell you whether your kid's doing better than average, worse than average, you're really good at this subject, not so good. The teachers know, but they don't tell parents because they don't trust parents with that information. They think if they tell parents, the parents will somehow misuse it to demoralise their kids or to make them big-headed. But with objective testing, at least the teachers would have the proper view of where the kids are on the scale nationally. But the SNP have been quite clear about their reasoning for these tests. It's all about closing the poverty-related attainment gap. In fact, everything they do in education is to do with closing the poverty-related attainment gap. I mean, they found that pupils in better off areas tend to perform at a higher level on average than pupils in less wealthy areas, and they regard that as some sort of injustice. What they won't accept is that in general, children from more affluent areas are more academically able on average. You can't judge individuals on that basis. We have exams, so you might have a pupil from a poorer school who does extremely well. They'll have the exam results to show. If someone's assuming that someone from a school in a wealthy area is going to be bright, then again, they've got their exam results. It might show otherwise. So they're just generalizations. But overall, it's the fact. There are other factors at play as well. For example, if you're brought up in a home where intellectual pursuits don't really feature in family life, that isn't going to help academic progress. You've got very disengaged parents, etc., etc. So there can be other challenges as well that might be particularly concentrated in poorer areas that can inhibit children's achievement. But as kids progress through school, to put it bluntly, IQ matters more and more. So if you've got super mum helping you with lots of your work, you go to a really good school in the early years, that can get you ahead of the game a bit. But by the time you're 15 or 16, your academic performance correlates very strongly indeed with IQ. So the Scottish Government's busy throwing money at lower performing schools in poorer areas and finding that it isn't really making much difference. So what can they do? So they brought in these tests into P1. Now P1 is virtually at the beginning of primary school. So if you find a big attainment gap in P1, whose fault's that? Well, it's maybe looking like it's not so much the fault of the education system, it must be the fault of the people who've been dealing with these kids before they go to school. In other words, the parents. The SNP's logic goes something like this. If all children were brought up in the same way, there would be no attainment gap before starting school. 2. There is an attainment gap. 3. Parents bringing up their own children leads to inequality. 4. Inequality is bad. 5. We must eliminate inequalities as far as we're able. Conclusion. The state must take over as much of the parenting role as possible. And we see that thinking in the doubling of nursery time for 3 and 4-year-olds. That's partly driven by feminist principle. They don't want anyone but mum looking after kids, mum should be out at work. But it's partly driven by this idea that if kids are all looked after in exactly the same way, then there'll be more equality, the outcomes will be more equal. When you look at that argument, the logic is actually valid. If 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5 were true, that conclusion would actually follow. But number 1 is false. Number 3 is only partly true. Another huge factor is genetics. Number 4 is not necessarily true. Inequalities can just reflect natural differences, different choices people make. And because 4 is not true, then 5 is not true either. So therefore the conclusion is not reliable at all. I really do despair at the level of political debate in Scotland. With these tests, the SNP are doing something perfectly reasonable, partly based on a faulty philosophy. But all the other Hollywood parties have just been hysterical, making these tests sound like a form of child abuse, talking about parents withdrawing their children from them. And that's the big educational controversy in Scotland at the moment, little online tests for P1 kids. Meanwhile, transgender indoctrination in primary schools moves on unopposed. We're not going to fix this sorry state of affairs by writing to MSPs and lobbying the political parties. It can only be fixed by changing MSPs. So in 2021, vote for the Scottish Family Party. Then we can have some sense spoken here instead of just here on YouTube. Well, thanks for watching. Do tell us what you think in the comments below. You can subscribe by clicking our logo in the centre of the screen. Do consider joining the Scottish Family Party. There's a link below. And here are some other videos you might find interesting as well.